first like to introduce the moderator for our first panel, Dr. Cassie Jones. And Dr. Jones is an associate professor in the Department of Animal Science and Industry at Kansas State University. She earned both her bachelor's and master's degrees at Kansas State, and then later, the latter of which with Dr. Mike Tokash. And then she completed her PhD with Dr. John Patience here at Iowa State. Her research efforts include evaluating the effects of ingredients and feed processing technologies on feed safety and animal nutrition. And outside of work, Dr. Jones does more work in raising Angus cattle with her family at their farm near Wamego, Kansas. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Cassie Jones.
Thanks, Nicole, and it's my pleasure to host the first panel of the conference this week. I was John's first PhD student, and so I got the pleasure of learning all sorts of things that first-round students get to do. So Amanda Chipman and Chad Pilcher and Trey Kellner and I spent a lot of time running water lines. Lots of interesting things that John taught us, not only swine nutrition, but substantial lessons in how to be good humans, how to work together, what's important in terms of professional development, and probably more importantly than anything, how to be passionate about pigs, about student development, and have work-life balance. So, John, thank you. As we get started on the panel, I want to kind of just set forth what the real intent of these panels will be. When we were working on the program committee, we wanted to make sure that there was enough dialogue so that we could learn from one another. I think that's something that we probably don't do enough of within the industry. It's great to come in, and there's so much value in listening to the round of speakers that we have, but we also know that there's a huge amount of people across the industry, and we can all learn from one another. And as we've gone through the last couple of years, we've certainly missed the opportunity to network and learn from one another in different ways. And so the goal of these panels is for broad discussion, not just us to be talking, but collectively all of you to be talking as well. And so my plea for you is to play along. And so as we get started, I have 2 or 3 questions for the panelists to start this morning, but then my ask of you is to be thinking of questions as well. And we have the microphones that you can tell that Kellner, Pilcher, and I were involved in the conference, because you can throw things at each other and it's okay. And so we have the microphones that we can literally throw at you, and appreciate your questions, comments, and any general discussion. I promise my job here is to make us out of here by 12:20 so we can enjoy the maple bacon cheesecake. So I will start with the panelists who are in front of us. So if you'll so allow me, I'll start with you guys and see if you'll first give me a little bit of what your background is.
Let me go first. Okay. I'm Chris Parks. My background, I was born and raised in the state of Delaware, which many people don't even know exists. It's 3 counties on the eastern seaboard, and it's full of chickens. Not a lot of pigs there. So really a chicken background. Went to NC State from undergrad in poultry science, and then graduate work, dabbled in waste management on the pig side, but turkey nutrition was really the focus of my studies there. And then from there, went to work for a poultry company that needed a swine nutritionist. So that was kind of the start of my swine career there. I've spent time both in production, on the production side, with pork companies, and I've spent some time on the kind of the allied industry side, on the ingredient supply side, whether it was vitamin premixes, things like that with DSM, or working on ractopamine and Pelleting studies with Elanco. Most recently, up until I've been with Cargill since January. I was with Smithfield for about 5 years, located in North Carolina. I'm still located in the eastern part of North Carolina. I've been with Cargill now for, 6 months? And kind of getting back into things, traveling around and meeting with customers, and getting back into nutrition. So enjoying it.
Ashton Yoder, originally from a small town in east central Kansas, moved over to Manhattan and got a bachelor's degree in feed science and management. And during that time, did some undergraduate research with Dr. Jones and had a couple internships. The first one was with New Fashion Pork. Shout out to Chad Hastad if you're here in the team. He mainly did work with him in the feed mills, but he liked me so much that he gave me the opportunity to sort pigs on the side and go to the research farm and do that for him. So it was a great experience. Other internships, did 2 internships with Land O'Lakes Purina and got done with the bachelor's degree and decided I wasn't ready for industry yet, and got a master's degree with Dr. Jones in swine nutrition. And that was Chad kind of started it with New Fashion Pork, the introduction to the swine industry, and kept it going with Dr. Jones. And then after that was done, got a full-time job with Atlanta Lakes Purina. I've been there for 3 years as an operations manager, 1 year at our Fort Worth plant, and currently I'm at our Wichita plant as an operations manager.
Roger Cochran, originally from Southern Indiana, went to a small private school, majored in chemistry and biology there in Franklin College. Kind of a unique trail for me to get back to agriculture. Grew up on a small crop farm and always wanted to find a way to get back into agriculture. And originally went out to Kansas State as going into my senior year of undergrad to do a research experience for undergraduates through the National Science Foundation. Found out I really enjoyed research, loved it, but absolutely hated the project I was doing from a renewable energy side. Spend 10 hours a day and get a drop of oil, not that fun. So from there, really liked K-State, enjoyed it there, enjoyed research. So started reaching out to faculty members, and originally reached out to Greg Aldridge, and then Cassie actually set in on the interview process and had the opportunity to choose which side I wanted to go, and ended up, in my opinion, making the right decision. Going the livestock route, and ended up being Cassie's first PhD student as well. The first time I actually stepped in the pig barn was when I got to grad school as well. So kind of a different track for me to get into the swine industry.
Great. And so then I'll ask Roger to start the next round of questions. In what ways do you interact with feed mills in your current job, or in immediate previous roles? So how do you directly interact with feed mills currently?
Yeah, so, and I guess I should have finished up too. Work for Pipestone Nutrition, been there about 3 years now. With Pipestone Nutrition, my main interaction is biosecurity audits. So spend basically 4 months out of the year traveling around to about 40 different feed mills. They'll see me twice a year, go through, do a biosecurity audit with them, and we've got to where we can kind of rank those mills, help them improve, provide feedback to them on areas of improvement. And then the other interaction side for me would be if we've got feed quality concerns at the farms. All the feed samples run through my desk, interact back with the feed mill with those results. If we need retained samples, any of those pieces will all run through my desk.
I'd say I've been an ops manager for about 3 years, so the first 2 years of that was focused more directly with the plant. It was mill efficiency, material yield or shrink. Can you hear me? Okay, it's back on. Then this past year has been a little bit of a change. It's still at the plant.
Don't hold it right by the bottom.
Hello? Oh, there, yeah.
Okay. And then the last year or so, it's been a little bit of a transition, getting away from the day-to-day and more towards higher level, working with other parts of the supply chain. Probably one of the most rewarding parts is collaborating with other groups, such as logistics. As we know, we have our operators at the plant driving efficiency, but there's also other parts of the supply chain that help drive efficiency. And I think the most frustrating thing, or one of them, that a plant would say is if you run out of an ingredient, you're planning for a truck to show up that day and it doesn't show up, you're out of that ingredient, it kind of shuts you down. So working with them and some other groups on how we can work with plants better and keep driving the efficiency.
I'd almost say now I'm kind of stuck in the middle. I call on pork producers that have feed mills, so I call on them externally. So working with them on feed formulation, feed ingredients, feed strategy. So I have that side of things. But then internally, Cargill also has complete feed mills. We have a number of premix plants, things like that. And so I have to sell and work on things internally with our own feed mills and plants, as the same time kind of selling and working on the outside. And sometimes those two can battle each other. If there's a problem internally with our plant, that affects external customers. Same thing with an external customer. If we're running projects or things with them and something goes wrong, that then reflects back on the internal feed mills. So it's probably the most unique. In the past, I've either been selling or working on things externally or internally, with company-owned feed mills. This is one that's kind of interesting. I'm kind of in the middle of both of them at this point. So.
So you can see from our panelists, they have a very diverse background in terms of how they are interacting currently and in previous roles with the feed industry. And I think that that's certainly something that I learned from John and from my training at K-State, which is it's great to formulate diets to a specific level, but we can't just assume that that email or code goes out and that's exactly what's delivered in front of the animal every single day. And so when we were working on panels, we thought that this was one that would make sense for us to kind of come back to what's practical for us to implement at the feed mill level. And more than anything, as we're talking from a nutrition perspective, how can nutritionists better work with the mills? And so my last question for you, so pressure out there that you have to start coming up with your own questions. My last question for you guys, and we'll start with you, Chris, on this one. What do you consider to be best practices for a nutritionist as they work to implement their decisions and those decisions at the feed mill so that things are done properly and with their intent?
Okay, I got a few things here. Start with communication. In my experience, feed mill managers especially do not like surprises. They don't like things showing up on their doorstep, ingredients, things like that. They don't like formulas that come to them with different ingredients they don't have. So the more you communicate, the better you're going to be in that situation. And in reality, you've got to involve them in the process. Get to know the feed mill people, get in there and understand their processes. What are their headaches? I mean, they're in a different situation. They're there to make feed, make a lot of feed, and make a lot of feed fast for low cost. I mean, that's their target. I get in the way of that, let's be honest. As a nutritionist, I get in the way of that a lot of times. So you've got to work within that system. The other thing that I've really, at least in my situations, being on production side, never have I had a feed mill manager that reported up to me. So I had no authority over these feed mill managers. So in a sense, you were trying to get them to come along and sell them on your idea or whatever you need them to do, or your concept, or Cassie, you know as well, FSMA regulations. You're selling them on these ideas, and you don't have that authority. So you've got to work with them, and in my opinion, make them a part of the process. They know a whole lot about those feed mills, way more than I ever knew. And so learning from them about how to do things, even from a basic of, I need a microbin open for an ingredient. I need to bring in wheat versus corn, what ratios, they need empty bins, things like that. Understand what they're going through, and be a part of that. We're looking back, we're talking about different stories, things that happened. We decided we were going to put a color in the early nursery diet, like a green-blue. I just sent the formula over and said, okay, good, get the color and all that. And the next thing I knew, I didn't go over there, I didn't realize what the process was. Everybody in the feed mill looked like a Smurf. So they're all covered with blue, and that was something I have to admit, I did not think through that one. So you learn, you make adjustments, you figure out what's going on, but at the end of the day, they can be, working with feed mill people, your greatest allies, because at the same time, when something goes wrong, you're all getting blamed. It's feed. It's either feed mill or the nutritionist or both of you that something went wrong. That's the first we blame. So they tend to be people, at least in my career, I like to have as allies, versus the opposite. So.
To add on to that, I would say one of the first questions that I would ask would be, what's the value? It sounds pretty simple, but a lot of times we kind of miss that. And for example, so if you're a nutritionist, you put out this diet, let's say it meets all the nutrient specs, it's a good cost, all that good stuff, and then you get to the plant, and the plant figures out that it's 80% hand ads. So it might be valuable to the nutritionist, but then is it practical? Can you manufacture it? So to add on to that, I would say find value that works not for just a certain group, but for the entire organization that you have. Another example, just some real world examples that we've seen. Same thing, you get a diet, it's got composed of 40%, calcium and monocal makes up 50% of the diet, and then they say, well, we want that pelleted. And as you can imagine, mineral, calcium, all that stuff doesn't really bind well, and it might run really rough. Another one that we've seen is in an early nursery diet, it's composed of various milk proteins that make up 70% of the diet. And it could be done, it's just not easy. I think we did the 70% milk protein at K-State. I want to say Morgan Cox, I'm not sure if that was you, but I do remember pelleting that, and then that was probably 3-4 years ago. The only thing I really remember, it was green, and we got it done, but it was, would not recommend that. It could be done, the plant just might not like you, but pretty much the takeaway is, if you're making a diet, just kind of either ask the plant for their opinion, they'll definitely tell you, or if you're able to understand some of the problems that they face, that's just going to make for a much smoother transition.
So for me, I would say, kind of building off Chris's comments, going back to communication and then relationship. Especially kind of in my role going out to these feed mills, they hear the word auditing, quality. It makes them pretty nervous. So, it's really important to start building that trust with them, going to those feed mills, visiting them. And what I really start to see from those specific visits is as things start to happen at the feed mills, or if issues arise. Is that better? If a wrong batch of feed gets made, wrong ingredients get added, they're more likely to tell you that something happened, and then you're going to really want to respect, thank them for letting you know that information. It's probably been one of the biggest things for me.
So I have one quote that's in my office. It is a Wayne Castism, and I tried to get these guys to work in as many Wayne Cast quotes as they could during their responses. You're failing at that, by the way.
We're not done.
But in one of Marcio, in one of his Swine podcasts, Wayne made the comment, if a feed mill calls you or anyone calls you and asks you a question, you should thank them profusely, because, and I need that constant reminder that when we're working in the industry in which we are, and whether we're talking about it in terms of feed mills, or we're talking about it in terms of individuals that report to us, or we report to them, or our direct colleagues, that it's important to be open to that dialogue and have those conversations. And so thank you, Wayne, for my favorite castism that's on my wall in my office. So at this point, I'll open up to you. What questions do you have for this group? Oh, okay. So a Wayne Cast question. When you do a mixer test, what nutrient do you prefer?
Wayne did not use the official box to speak into, so I'm not taking that question.
As usual, Wayne's making me do the work for him.
Wayne needs the fuzzy box, yeah. So, I don't know if I have a favorite, to be honest with you. We just had this debate about 2 weeks ago, Chad and I and somebody else. We went away from salt. I've done methionine before. I believe Alamet is what we were using at the time. And then one of the other minerals, I want to say it was manganese, because that's one of the few that we add in a specific amount that really not coming from a whole lot of other ingredients. So if I have to pick a favorite, I guess we'll say manganese, maybe. Anybody else?
Yeah, I'd say I'm pretty sure we use cobalt. Not 100% sure, but we use cobalt. I don't know why, but I do know that we do use that.
From the feed mill side and, quick and dirty in some of these mills, we don't like to use salt, but it gives us somewhat of an idea. So I think that's the quick and dirty method. Just, do salt, but then follow up with your actual mineral test.
Key points on that: make sure you don't use coarse salt, that you're using fine salt, right? If you're going to be doing that, we learned that the hard way. And and if you're going to be using a mineral, a specific something, whichever one is free happens to be the one that I see a lot of people use.
Does pool salt count? Can we use that too? Okay. Just making sure. It happens. So.
We have a question back there.
We have a question from Neil Ferguson in Canada, and he asks, how do you manage ingredient variation, and how frequently do you update your nutrient values to manage this ingredient variation?
Yeah, I could take that.
Handoff.
Yeah, so we get ingredients in and then we measure. We just do an NAR analysis, and then it's sent to our formulation team, and they look at the values and we update them. I'm not for sure on the frequency. It's fairly often, but we do. Our operators, our quality technicians, they take I think almost every ingredient, at least our bulk ingredients, and do an NAR. That way we're getting the most up-to-date kind of nutrients, just in case because of the ingredient variation.
I'll add to that a little bit. Part of our strategy was based on risk. So, we were sampling all ingredients, but we may sample corn, soybean meal a little bit less than something like a meat and bone meal. Coming from some of the plants that we work with, those seem to be the most volatile ingredients, so we had a little bit higher risk profile attached to those ingredients. So those would be, monitored more often, data would be uploaded more often, things like that, and probably increased safety specs too when we did that as well. So.
What would be your preference for ingredient sequencing?
Sure. Yeah, for ingredient sequencing, I would just first outline, obviously, what's your major ingredients that are going to harm something, copper and sheep, and if you make sheep feed, if there happens to be a few folks in here, obviously you want to look out for copper. But I would focus on the things that are going to be harmful, or if you are if you're concerned about color and all that stuff, then you can sequence for color. But definitely, and then if you do need a sequence, obviously try to avoid as many flushes as you can, if you can. If you can have a diet, put a diet in between that doesn't cause harm, or it's not going to be harmful to that either age of the animal or that species of animal. Definitely go with that, but if you have to, you can always flush your mixer with 500 pounds or 1,000 pounds, whatever it may be, just as a way to completely, hopefully avoid that potential harm.
To add on that too, I think important, when we're actually going out to these feed mills, if you're visiting with them, check their sequencing, their flushing protocols. I'm a documentation person, so I like to see what they've got, written out, if they're actually keeping track of that information. And it's also a good opportunity for you, as you're in there, to give them a learning experience and help them understand further why it's important if they're not doing it like they should. So again, building that trust for them and learning from you in that process.
So those of you who haven't yet, this throw box is kind of cool and makes you really want to throw it at or to someone, just so you know. So being in the ingredient business, one of the things we see a lot of is submissions for doing CV analysis on feeds. I'm interested in the three of you's comments and for other people to consider in here. What is your ideal CV on a mixer test, and what is the foundation why you have that ideal CV in mind?
I feel like I'm being set up here, but I'm going to go for it. We've always gone with the classic, 10%. Below 10%, it's you're good to go. If you're a little outside of that, maybe you come back around and you recheck it. I'm not going to go crazy. I like to see things. I like to watch the ebb and flow of things, and if it really gets out of whack, that's when I get concerned. Are you advocating for loosening that higher based on certain products, I guess, and things like that, or is it? And I don't. I don't really the background. Yeah, it's 10%, but I couldn't tell you if that's 15,
Well, so
20.
we get into this, and 10% tends to be a fairly common number, but then if we start looking at the data and what's really the foundation around what does the pig tell us about the performance at different CVs, do we really have that data to say that 10% is really where we want to be? Because we see some people that want to be down at 5 to 8 sometimes, but what do the pigs tell us about why we set that number where we tend to end up at?
Yeah, there's learning to be done there. The other side of that too is not just your mixer itself, but then your batching variances. how are these ingredients being added? Are they accurately being added at that point, and then you're mixing and things like that? If I strayed from pigs a little bit, and this is a long, long time ago, there was a study in poultry with phytase that basically dosed it over in different times versus constantly in the feed. And in that example, it showed it didn't impact the efficacy of it. So you're right. Is there room to go a little higher? 5 to 8's probably pretty tight for the feed mills, at least that I dealt with. That's pretty tight. That'd be tough. I'd run around all day trying to figure that part out and never really get past it. So yeah.
That's a good question, Brad, and I think I must be getting old enough that now I have stories that I can lend to things, and so I actually know the root of the 10%. So, yeah, you guys are laughing because you're scared to say it. So Charles Stark told us this story that he was working on his dissertation, and Keith Binke walked into his office and said, "You've got to make a recommendation." You can't, that he was kind of talking about this exact same issue and said, you've laid out some good arguments, but you've got to come up with a number. What should the number be? And that's how the number came up. And so that's where that first initial table of how much longer do you need to mix based on percent CV is that it was built on the best science we had at the time in 1978, I believe. And so, and 82 and 83. And so things have changed. We've learned several different things. I think some of the best work I've seen is Crystal Grossbeck's data on mixing. And ultimately, I think your question, Brad, is it depends. The answer to that is it depends. It depends on the size of the animal. It depends on how much they eat, what their meal size is. Certainly, like Ashton was talking about, if there's any regulated materials or ingredients. And so if we're talking anything that's medicated, if we're talking anything that has a tight deficiency, toxicity window, if anything like selenium, where we have some regulations associated with that, we've got to be much more careful than maybe in other circumstances, especially those nursery diets. That's where I've certainly been in mills as well, that in highly medicated diets for early nursery pigs where there's small meal sizes, that they're pushing 5 to 8% and taking the care and the time to get that done. That said, a lot of the data would support if you're feeding a sow or if you're feeding a finishing pig at ad lib, you can batch those ingredients and discharge them according to what Crystal's data is and not even turn the mixer on. And typically that animal is eating sufficient quantities that they're able to meet their nutrient requirements without substantially altering growth performance. And so, I don't know, we can talk in the hallways about that one. But again, I think it depends. It depends on the situation and the size of the animal and what types of ingredients are in there.
To follow up, as for the feed mill, is it regulatory that like FDA they say it needs to be under 10%? Is that a rule? Okay, maybe not.
No, the FDA would, same as us, right? There's no data. So yeah, we'd like to see it below 10%. But more than anything, they're going to analyze, right? They'll pull a feed sample, they'll pull for nutrient specs, and we'll make sure that it's within the accepted analytical variation based on those nutrient specs. And so that factors into that one as well. They're not going to pull the 10 different samples to make sure that the mixer is efficiently mixing. It just better mix efficiently enough so that the sample they pull is within the accepted nutrient and analytical variation. Yeah, a question down here?
There's a couple of questions up here, actually, Cassie.
Okay, great, please.
So we've talked a lot about feed mill biosecurity over the last handful of years, Roger, right? And so I'd be interested to hear from each of you kind of some of the things you're doing and in your mills or what you're seeing out there that's working, but also maybe some of the things that we as nutritionists are asking our feed mills to do that are just a total flop. And I even for the most nimble person trying to put on booties over your work boots as you're getting out of a truck in the right way is a heck of a hard task, let alone if you're the normal feed truck driver that's out there trying to get it done as well too. And so I'd like to hear some of those things that maybe we're causing some confusion in the system by what we're asking for as well too, or if there's different ways we need to be getting it done the right way.
Sure. So biggest flop, and you kind of hit it on the head, is booties, in my opinion. We're asking drivers to put on booties. Every time I've, been around it, they're not changing them in and out of the truck. It's one pair the whole time they're there. So it I think that's probably the biggest flop that we see. Probably, thinking, how do we fix that? Start thinking of, is there a way to, disinfect shoes more frequently within those trucks? And then really the cabs of the trucks. I think the cabs of the trucks get overlooked a lot. And I know Jordan has some data on that from the Vietnam data. I think it gets overlooked a lot when it comes to the feed mill. I think that's maybe where we should start trying to push more towards the mills, is making sure that they're disinfecting those cabs more frequently. I think another, it's not a flop, but something to consider when we think biosecurity at the feed mill would be the pyramids. A lot of us talk about, the flow of trucks. They should go to our high health farms first and down. And I think the thing that causes the most disconnect in those levels is feed ordering. So working with the farms to make sure they get feed orders in on time, to especially the sow farms, pretty consistent ordering patterns, making sure that they can get those trucks washed, disinfected before they have to go back up that pyramid to those sow farms would be two of the biggest areas. I think other than that, the information, and I believe it was some of Cassie's work, I use that information a lot where they went in and actually swabbed feed mills. I take that data to the feed mills, show them, hey, if we're going to have something come into this specific feed mill, these are my high priority areas. And that's where I work to try and address those issues with them. So I really focus a lot on the receiving pit, and then I've really started focusing more on the foot traffic area. I know guys don't like to use receiving boxes. They don't like to use receiving pit covers. But the more we can teach, the more we can show them how important it is to do that. It seems like there's been a change at those mills to incorporate those. And then I guess the last piece to add there too is we've started scoring the feed mills. So the audit that we go through and do, we actually give them a score back out of 100%. And you all are very aware that our industry is very competitive. And once they start to see where they score, if they're not scoring very well, we start to see some procedures, written procedures getting put in place. And that's kind of that driving factor for them to improve.
I would say from our side, I'm personally not involved kind of with the biosecurity measures that our plants take, but we do work with folks like Roger, and I think we literally work with folks like Roger at a few of our plants. I haven't been to those plants, but we would lean on him to audit us, to give us kind of the steps we need to take to meet their needs for their pigs' safety.
I'd say, from my standpoint, just thinking back, my previous position, one of the big areas is just site security, keeping people off of those sites. Some of them are fairly large, obviously. It's hard to fence them all in, but at the same time, you also realize from a standpoint, can somebody just walk right in? Yeah, there's operations, they literally could walk right in, especially on a weekend if they close down on a Sunday. It's wide open. So when we think of things like that's probably one that keeps me up at night, and probably realize why we hadn't had anything like that before, but that's probably a big one for me.
Hi, I have a question about particle size. So let's say after we receive a particle size analysis report, in addition to the mean particle size, what else you would to look into and such like the particle size distribution, or if yes, how would you interpret that? Yeah.
You want to take that one? Oh. You want to take that one? Nobody? Take this one. Okay, I'll go. So particle size variation, you're trying to hit obviously an average, but then you've got a spread there too. You've got dispersion. There's an energy factor in that. First of all, is that as much energy available to the animal as possible. The second thing is a production side. I mean, and depending on the system, roller mill, hammer mill, things like that. I know in the past we've struggled with some systems especially switching back and forth. So we may feed a very fine grind for a finishing feed, and then all of a sudden turn around and try and feed a coarse grind for a sow feed. It's tough to hit the two of those, and do them both well. And so really, I think they tend to dial in on the finishing feed side, get it fine. Then the coarse one, that's where you tend to have problems. You may have an average that's okay, but you're all over the board in terms of what else comes along with it, anywhere from fine powder to whole kernels of corn coming through at that point. So that's the tough part of that one. Really, when you get to that size, yeah, the roller mill's definitely going to be easier to accomplish that. But
Yeah, I was going to say,
jump in.
just for reference, if you have a hammer mill, expect a wider deviation. If you want consistency, definitely go with the roller mill. As you can imagine, that hammer mill is going to come around and hit that kernels, and so you're going to get really fine pieces and maybe some larger pieces. So that's going to increase your deviation.
I think something to add there too, as you're looking at your particle size graph, is understand the corn crop from that year. I think it was a year ago when we had really dry corn, started to see wider distributions, corn really getting really fine on us and not being able to coarsen that up. So understand the corn grind. I think looking at the deviations, another important piece, especially as you're communicating back to the feed mill. If that deviation starts to get wide, you can use that information. See, have they made a roll change if they're using a roller mill as well?
That's a really good point, Roger. So when you're looking at an individual analysis, understand the scope of that analysis. Understand the scope of that analysis. And so I think probably more value in the trend of that and how it fits into the overall picture of that trend. Certainly both the mean as well as the variation. You'll see seasonal trends, and so you'll get greater deviation from corn that's been pulled out of a cold bin in southern Minnesota than you will in this time of year when that corn is warm. And so just based on how we have fracture points of those kernels and understanding what season you're in, what to expect, and being able to kind of track and trend that within a single mill over time is probably the most important part.
And sample numbers. I mean, if you're taking one sample per week, for example, that's not going to be probably pretty representative. So the more samples, like anything else, the more samples you get, and again, I agree, watching that trend is what I would watch, because then you can see if something really goes wrong, and figure that out. So.
All right, Cassie, Ashton, I'm glad they consider you an expert still after working with me for so long, but question for the panel is, how often and how much of a retained sample do you take and how long do you keep it? So when the animal health professional questions you have adequate sample.
Yeah, we retain every sample, and I believe it's for 6 months. And then after 6 months, we just, at the end of every 6-month period, we take that last month and bring in the new month. So, after that time, if you keep them you can keep them longer, but usually you might see some. If you have pellets, for instance, they might start molding in the Worley Pack bags if you're not putting them in a dry, cool place. So it seems to, after that time, they might even mold and not be any good anymore anyway. Size of sample? I would say maybe 500 grams. It's just a pretty small Worley Pack bag. I think that's been enough for us. A lot of times if we need a sample, we might need to send 100 grams to a lab, so we try to get at least 500, I think.
I usually ask for a boot full or a bread bag full. That's usually what we end up getting. A little more on that question, though. Part of that, for me, depended on, are you selling feed to outside customers, or is this an internal situation? Because we didn't have... If we had a feed mill that was 20,000 tons a week, you run out of space to keep samples of every single thing you make and every ingredient you bring in. So really, again, it goes back to that risk profile. Corn, we're analyzing corn at the lab, but we're not going to save a sample of corn for 6 months. It's corn. I mean, other than maybe pesticides, whatever could be on it. Things like bakery fat, we'd keep a lot longer because of the things that you can find in fat. Meat and bone meal, some things like that. Finished feed, I want to say we did a month at the most on some of these is what we kept. And again, go back to the risk of what's the worst that can happen to this versus soybean meal or corn is kind of that. Now, on the other hand, if I were in the situation where it was a feed mill selling to customers, things like that, 6 months. You wanted to keep every single thing you had for as long as you could just to make sure. So.
Hi, so I'm Alex Fisk, and I'm a student at NC State University. We've been doing a lot of work with automated feed systems, which basically takes out all human interaction between the farm and the feed mill. And I know you guys have talked a lot about relationships and communication and just having that interaction. So the question I have for you is, have you had any experiences with the automated feed systems? And like, if you have, what are some of the pros and cons you can see with those?
When you say automated feed systems, I want to make sure I'm in the right place here. On farm?
So yes, both.
Okay. I'll be honest. I don't have a ton of experience with the on-farm ones. I've had a little bit of experience with the liquid feed systems. I don't want to talk about that. Move on from that one. But I'll be honest, I don't have a whole lot with on-farm complete feed systems in my background.
Is this the kind of the on-farm system? I'm not familiar with it, but I've heard a little bit of it. Does it notify the plant? Does the plant get information of, for instance, how full the bin is?
Yes,
okay.
Exactly. Yeah, so it has real time where they can see exactly how much is in there. It will automatically order feed for you.
Okay. So you're not making feed on farm. It's a feed bin monitoring.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Yeah, I do have more experience with that one.
Yeah, it takes away from somebody going and physically checking the bin. With that, I'm not, like I said, I'm not familiar with it. The only thing I would check is, I'm guessing there's sensors in there that kind of tell you how much is in it. You might want to check it every now and then, just make sure that there's not feed hung up on those sensors and give you a wrong signal, and then one day you there's no feed pulling out of your auger and you wonder why.
Yeah, it's a good point. That's a passionate area for me, because the attention put on feeding on the farm level, it can vary. You have people that are on it every day. You have people that don't show up every day to the farm. It's all over the board. And frankly, with the labor situation that we just continue to see, we're going to have less and less experienced farm labor. Anything that you can do to take that decision away from them and bring it back to the feed mill, if you will, is going to be more efficient. The other side of that is, this is how I look at this. A lot of these, especially an integrated company, you own the pigs, you own the feed, you own the trucks, you own the service, everything around that you own the feed mills, that multi-million-dollar beast. And at the last second, we hand off that decision to somebody else that doesn't have skin in the game about when do these pigs need feed. And that then impacts the entire schedule downhill for feed mills, feed delivery, ingredient procurement, all of those things. So to me, if you own feed demand in the field by knowing and understanding when you need feed and what feed you need and where, you control then the rest of your system at that point. I think that's a huge area to move into.
Look at how much feed storage you have at the farm compared to the mill. It's like 8 fold. So you can
One last question, if we have time, Cassie. When you guys, going back to CV, especially early feed or medicated feed, have you guys looked at measuring it in the feeder versus in the mixer? And do you think that we're missing anything out that, especially on those highly important diets, by not measuring it at the final place versus then taking it somewhere in between the process?
Based on blank looks up here, I'm going with no. Maybe we should, but there is a little bit of thought process and theory behind segregation and ingredient segregation. We actually don't see very much segregation, and so I would not be worried. I think that we have an obligation and the best capability to make sure that it's well mixed, leaving the mixer. And I think at that point, I don't put a lot of trust or faith in the concept of nutrients segregating out to problematic levels, unless we have some really bad pellet quality problems. But even at that point, historically, we haven't really struggled with that one. And so I'd say if you're going to be mixing those high risk ingredients or highly concentrated ingredients where CV is really important, I'd say measuring it at the mixer is your best opportunity to correct any challenges, because those downstream things are too variable, in my opinion, probably, and too difficult to monitor and consistently work to improve. That said, I think that it's important to just circle back on that and make sure that when we're looking at mill efficiency and when we're looking at making sure that we're getting the right feed in front of the right pigs at the right time, and all of those aspects, that it is important that we consider CV, and again, back to the size of the animal that we're feeding. And so it can be, mixer efficiency can become a bottleneck within a feed mill, and an unnecessary bottleneck, but at the same point, we can get ourselves into a world of trouble if we're not paying attention to it at times when we need to. I do know we have one more question with Maliki. Maliki's been trying to ask a question since the beginning.
Yeah, so if you're going to if I'm building a new feed mill, do I put in a pelleter or just do meal feed or mash feed? What would you do to that?
I'd say if you have the capital, go for pelleted. And the benefits of that, we talked a little bit about gain in feed to gain ratio, but also flow. The feed's going to flow a lot better. For instance, like we talked about, a few bin hangs, it's going to flow a lot better, and it's going to be a lot less dust inside the barns, which might be just beneficial for the workers and things like that. It is very expensive. You got to put in a boiler, obviously a pellet mill, a cooler. It's more than just put in a pellet mill. You got to essentially put in a whole new process, and so it could be very expensive. So you definitely need to look at the long-term gains you might see, and what's your return on investment.
It's the pay. Does it pay? His main question is, does it pay? Whenever I get asked that question, Maliki, I come back with a question. Are you going to pellet well?
That was what I was going to ask.
Or can you pellet well?
What are the expectations? Yeah.
And so if the time is taken to pellet well and to run the system at 100 to 120% capacity and not 200 or 300% capacity, which is what unfortunately we see a lot of pellet mills run at, then I think it's worthwhile to put in a pellet mill. If you're going to be pushing that system to the point that you cannot deliver high quality pellets to the animal, it's not worth putting in a pellet mill in the first place. More comments?
One last comment, kind of go back. A lot of questions around the CV side as I was sitting here thinking. We think of it getting wider, not too big of a deal, but I don't want us to forget that it's a really good tool for us to catch issues as well. As that CV, if it's 20 or it starts getting up, we've got something going on in that feed or in that mixer or that mill, whether it's, a fat nozzle broke off. We've ran into that before. So I think it's still good to do and utilize definitely as a tool for us.
That's a good point. All right, guys, so I will get ready to dismiss you for lunch. Let's thank this group first. Chris has the best socks of the day. He has bacon socks on, which I think are very fitting for the maple bacon cheesecake that I'm excited about.
Bacon goes with everything. And they do not match my shirt, but it doesn't matter.
Lunch will be upstairs in rooms 220 to 240, and it is ready for us. So go ahead and make your way upstairs. Thank you.